As I drove to work this morning, I passed by field after field. Open areas of cultivated land where farmers have been raising crops for over 100 years. I make this drive maybe 6 times a week. And I've watched as the land has changed. I grew up here in this very river valley. What used to be small towns have now become booming cities with thousands of people. People coming and going. Many of these are bedroom communities where people commute to their employment in some other city. And as a result, so few recognize the changes that have transpired in these short years. There has been a silent witness to all this change. She is laid quietly as men have trampled over her, as buildings are built all around, and trees are laid waste so that progress can be made. She's been recording and remembering everything. She is the land. And though some would say that she's not alive, it doesn't mean she doesn't have a memory. Forensic science tells us that soil remembers. It carries the evidence of all those who've walked before. Every fiber dropped to the ground is remembered. I've lived in this river valley much of my life. I have family buried in this ground, and I too am raising my children here. I was raised hearing tales of the old days, stories about pioneers and settlers, Native Americans and wars, because my dad loved to learn, especially anything to do with history. So we would stop by historical markers along highways just in case there was some significant event in history that took place there. We would travel hours and hours just to see a Civil War battlefield. Yet, in my formative years, I don't recall ever hearing the story of this land, the land where I live. And this is where my journey began. I was visiting a nearby city with my family the summer before last, and in this city there was a memorial. It was a statue of a large white buffalo surrounded by a small park. The park was right along a major road and seemed relatively insignificant in scope, yet the buffalo got my attention, so I stopped by to check it out. On the placard near the memorial was a chronicle of the Dakota War of 1862. The memorial marked the ending of that war, where 38 men were hung for war crimes. This war took place right in my backyard. Yet I had no memory of hearing about it or any sense of understanding towards the parties involved. This was significant to me because I grew up in a town with a Native American reservation in it, and I had friends who were Native American, yet I was completely ignorant to this history. The timing for finding this memorial seemed almost providential as well, because this summer would mark the 150th year anniversary of this war. You know, sometimes things happen in life that are good, but they seem accidental. You just feel lucky to have stumbled upon it. Well, this did not feel anything like that. This felt more like I was chosen for a task, like something bigger than me was happening, and I was just getting to play a part in it. That feeling started to drive my curiosity. It was like I was being pulled to do research and learn more about this. So I did the first logical thing that I knew to do. I went to a coffee shop and got on the internet, and I Googled it. There, I would find a listing of historical places to visit. And since my upbringing had model road trips, I would jump in my car and run off and visit the first one on the list. At that first historical site, I bumped into a man in the bookstore that would change the direction of my journey completely. He just happened to be a local historian on the Dakota War. We connected, and through conversation, he recommended some resources. One of these books contained a listing of dates chronicling each of the events of the Dakota War. When I saw this, it sparked an idea. What if I was to travel to each one of these historical sites in chronological order of the events that took place? And what if I did it on the exact date in history that they took place? What if I took my 9-year-old son along with me? So that's what I did. I visited each of the historical sites on the exact date of their 150th year anniversary. I brought my camera with and took some footage along the way. This would take me several months of filming and hundreds of miles of driving, but it meant many hours of connection with my son and a grand adventure that I could share with all. So here's what we learned. The story of our government's interactions with Native Americans throughout history could be described as tragic at best. Leading into this time of history, there were several failed treaties between the government and the natives. They promised to give food and material provisions as well as protected lands. In exchange, the natives would give over the rights to the territory of Minnesota. Settlers were soon invading this land, and this disrupted the hunting and animal populations, so meat was becoming scarce. And unfortunately, the land given to the natives along the Minnesota River Valley as a reservation were not the best for farming. This led to a time of food shortage. What would add even more stress to the interactions between the white man and the natives was the time in history this was happening. Our nation was now neck deep in the Civil War, so food rations and supplies were in high demand but in short supply. This led to payments often being late to the natives. Now add an opportunity on top of that for businessmen to make money, and well, we're heading into trouble. Men began to trade with the Native Americans the goods that they needed. In exchange, the natives would pay them when the government gave them their annuity payments. This created a debt system and even more misunderstanding. Now when the government would make payments to the natives, the traders would step in and take the provisions in payment for the Indians' debt. Tension was high, provision was low, and these misunderstandings were happening all over the place. It would only take a small spark to light this fire of pride, and that is exactly what happened. A war was started. In Dakota tradition, war was a bloody and terrifying experience. The rules for war were not governed by Western civility. All people involved were considered combatants, so women and children were not off limits. To the invading settlers, this was an abomination and caused an uproar in response. In the end, this uprising would be quenched by an army of professional soldiers. The native men involved would be tried by military trial and sentenced to death. Abraham Lincoln was personally involved by looking over each one of the trial results. He would stay the execution of all but 39 of the Native Americans. And in the end, 38 would be hung from gallows in Mankato, Minnesota on December 26, 1862. This marks our nation's largest public execution to date. The reaction to the Dakota style of war was hostile, and as a result, the treatment towards the Dakota became inhumane and equally savage. This was not a shining point of our nation's history. This would mark the end of civility in general towards the Native Americans. Our government would no longer be dealing in treaties, and this war sparked many other conflicts in the western frontiers, and the end of those were equally as tragic. The Minnesota River Valley and surrounding prairie areas were abandoned by most settlers during the war. Many of the families who fled their farms and homes as refugees never returned. But following the Civil War, the area was resettled. Although some Dakota opposed the war, most of them were expelled from Minnesota. By the late 1920s, the conflict began to pass into the realm of oral tradition. Eyewitness accounts were passed on to friends and family who survived into the 1970s and early 80s. The stories of innocent individuals and families being killed by the Dakota, well, those stories are still very much alive in the communities of south central Minnesota. And perhaps hostilities have gone dormant, the sting still remains. The sting remains in another group of people as well. The story of broken treaties and a stolen heritage well, that's very much alive in the Dakota people. Several of the tribes have not recovered from the tragedies of these conflicts during this part of history. And although it's been 150 years since these events took place, many still carry the pain of loss near their hearts. Life moves on all around them, but some are still stuck. I'm a father now, and I want my children to grow up knowing the history of the land they live in. One of my biggest takeaways from this experience ended up being something so simple. I realized that growing up in a place didn't automatically give me understanding for what had happened there in history. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but it was true. I realized that I have a responsibility to steward the story of the land. I live here now, so this land story is now mine. And it continues on every day. And every day I have this opportunity. I can add strength and joy and contribute good things into the land, or I can repeat history by living in bitterness and resentment towards those who have been ignorant in its past. I've heard it said many times, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, I don't plan on being one of them. This present time someday will be remembered as history. I want to be remembered as somebody who brought peace to my time. I want to be remembered as one who learned from the past and then created a better future for his children and grandchildren. That's how I want to be remembered. How do you want to be remembered?